kind of since then, but mostly medieval times. So we're talking about, you know, the time of Elizabeth I, the time of Henry VIII, Mary Queen of Scots. That's the kind of time period we're looking at. So we're not kind of, we haven't arrived here, you know, 50 years ago or whatever. This has been a historical thing, and the discrimination we've experienced and racism we've experienced has been historical for hundreds of years. So that's one group. And, you know, our language is still based on, you know, Indian languages, and that's where they first kind of started figuring out where we were from, origin wise. So linguists came along and they compared our languages to Indian language, and they're like, okay, does this make sense now? Then geneticists come along and they find out, you know, our DNA, you can only find certain, you know, sections of DNA and stuff in populations that are around an area in northern India. So that's Rajasthan and Punjab. Sorry, that's my sister's dog. So Rajasthan and Punjab, so that's where you find it. And then there's the second group, which is Roma. So Roma are kind of people, we've gone all the way to Britain. Roma are people on that migration, communities have settled along the way, or they've been, you know, enslaved, or for whatever reason they've settled along the way. They've liked the local religion, local custom, they've just fitted in and then never left. So Roma often kind of originate from, you know, Eastern Europe, but on that whole way from India, you have populations that have been kind of settled on the way. They have a similar language to us. They have similar, you know, genetics to us. But obviously the populations over 500 years have diverged somewhat. And, you know, I don't mind being called a gypsy, but somebody who's an Eastern European Roma or something might find that offensive, and that's due to historical context locally. Now, the third group is different again. So I always say to people, you know, throughout history, 99%, I mean, you'll probably be able to tell them more, Becky, but throughout history, a lot of populations have been nomadic at some point or another. So it's not uncommon historically. Now, there's another group, which is travellers. So travellers aren't gypsies. They don't have the same origin. There's Irish travellers, there's Scottish travellers. But once again, it's a bit like the word gypsy. It doesn't really come from a term that they've claimed themselves. Like that's not a name they came up with. So I'm sure, I'll leave Becky to explain the word gypsy. I'm sure she'll have a better way of explaining it than me. But it's the same with travellers. These words are imposed upon us. Irish travellers, you know, you usually use the term pavi or minkir, and we just often use the word Romany, but gypsy's fine for us. But for Roma, call them Roma. And respect them like that. But yeah, so three different communities, but travellers originate from these islands, or they've come a lot earlier than we've come, but different genetic origins, different languages as well. So they're more like Celtic languages rather than from the Indian subcontinent. Anyway, I'll hand over to Becky because we both have a habit for talking. So.
Yeah, we can confess. But I just posted in the chat. So Traveller Times, which is the national media organisation for Gypsies and Travellers, has got some really nice resources on their site. And the link that I've just posted is to a short infographic video which explains those different heritages really well. I mean, I think Luke's sort of basically covered it quite nicely, but if you're doing sort of teaching or you're trying to explain that to other people and you're feeling uncertain, that's quite a nice short video that you can point people to that gives that explanation. The only thing I would kind of add to Luke's account there is, I think with the Roma, so a lot of the Roma groups who are sort of from the Balkans or Eastern Europe under socialism and before that experienced quite a lot of very heavy assimilation programs, enforced settlement, and a lot of persecution which erupted after 1989 and the collapse of socialism. So the Roma communities that we have in the UK today have tended to arrive after 1989, and particularly after the expansion of the EU. And although, as Luke has said, that there are these historical and linguistic links, British gypsies would see themselves as being very distinct to Roma who have come from Eastern Europe more recently. And whereas British gypsies until quite recently have primarily been very mobile for a lot of Eastern European and Balkan gypsies, or sorry, Roma, that sort of died out much earlier in the 20th century because of the policies that they suffered at the hands of the socialist state, and before that, sort of Nazi regimes for people who were living under Nazism. So I think that probably covers us for now.
Thank you for that. Just sort of leading on from there, what has the relationship between Gypsy Traveller communities in sort of all of their diversity been like with the British state specifically? So Becky, do you want to start this time and then we can alternate?
Yeah. If you're happy with that, Luke? Yeah.
More than happy.
Okay, so I mean, here we're what I'm going to be mainly talking about are the group that we now think of as being as English gypsies, because of those Scots and Irish. So Scots and Irish travellers very often, in fact, tie their heritage to the land. The British would say land reforms, but land policies enacted in Ireland, which caused lots of people to become landless and homeless from the early modern period onwards. In Scotland, to the clearances. So if we're sort of thinking about Irish and Scots travellers' relationships with the British state, it's, you know, their very genesis is often seen as tied to British colonialism, or English colonialism, as we can think of. What I'm going to talk about now, however, is more how things might have been seen from the British Romany Gypsy point of view. So I think one of the things that I find interesting as a historian, and I'm just going to be a little bit nerdy just for a little bit, is that so in the early modern period, we've got, I think, two different things going on. As Luke said, we had the groups that we would now think of as being British gypsies turning up in the 15th and 16th century. When they very first turned up, they were sort of welcomed in the court of James IV, and they were seen as being these kind of exotic musicians and entertainers and fortune tellers, and they were sort of, and so paradoxically, they were both seen as being very much outsiders in European society, but also because of that exoticness, they weren't seen as being a threat, but they were seen as entertaining. What we see for the historians amongst us then is in the 16th century, we have the rise, a mass rise in vagrancy across the general population because of economic turmoil. We also have the fracturing of the Catholic Church with the Reformation, and these two things together mean that sort of traditions of pilgrimage and travel, which were something that gypsies, when they first turned up in Western Europe, they sort of traveled with these indulgences and these other sort of certificates, basically saying that we're allowed to travel because the Pope has said that we're to travel for 7 years as a pilgrim. And people go, oh, all right then. And they were accepted. But from the 16th and 17th century, we see that disintegrating and a whole series of laws being enacted, both against vagrancy in general, but also specifically against gypsies, not just in the UK, but right across Western Europe. And this is the period where we have legislation being passed, which means that it basically outlaws the very fact of being a gypsy. So that if you're caught, your first offence of being a gypsy, you might be flogged. On the second offence of being a gypsy, because you haven't stopped being a gypsy, you might have your ear cut off. Your third case of being a gypsy, you might either be transported to the Americas or you're executed. Okay, and we have these kinds of legislation being passed right across Western Europe. But at the same time, what we have is right across Western Europe, including the UK, Roma Gypsy groups becoming an everyday part of European life. So right across Europe, you know, we see Spanish gypsies starting to develop a particular and distinctive culture. We see that in France, we see it in the German states, we see it in Britain, and increasingly the Romany languages that in the 15th century they were seen as being, you know, everyone could have understood each other right across Europe if you were speaking Romany. By the 17th and the 18th century, that's starting to fracture. So you've got different kinds of Romany languages developing. And so what we've got simultaneously is the state trying to stamp out gypsies, but at the same time we see them being established. So one of the things that I have done as a historian, as I kind of look at the gap between what the state tries to do and what it's actually able to do, and what we see is that despite the heavy persecution in legislature in the early modern period, and although the profound impact that has on particular individuals and individuals' families, overall what we see in the early modern period is the concerted failure of those legislative attempts to stamp out gypsies from across Europe. What we see in the 19th century is the state being less bothered. So the British state in the 19th, I'd never say there's a golden age of being a gypsy in Britain, but the closest you've got to not being horrendously targeted is in the mid and the late 19th century. And if you think about it, the gypsy wagon, you know, the bow-top wagon, the Reading wagon, this, you know, very strong icon of gypsy traveller culture, this is its high point. Before the 1830s, the roads were too rubbish to have heavy ornate caravans because they'd get stuck, and people generally travelled with horses and their bender poles tied onto a back of a mule or a horse. And also, you know, in the 18th century, you wouldn't want to massively advertise the fact that you were a gypsy by turning up with your beautiful showman's, with your beautiful Reading wagon or your bow-top wagon. You need to kind of be able to hide your identity when it's possible. In the 19th century, that's not necessary. And so we see this amazing flowering of gypsy culture and how it is articulated in particular through the decoration and the craft of the wagon. That's really, and I think that we can see that as being, you know, this is the period when, I mean, the state's still arguing with itself over who it should regulate and how. And so, yes, you know, gypsies in this period are still being moved on under the 1824 Vagrancy Act, for example. But by and large, you know, they're left as much alone as they ever are. In the 20th century, we see this changing. We see the 20th century regulatory state starting to define what spaces are for who. And we can see this, we can tie this to the rise, you know, the very legitimate rise from the left, from the Labour movement of wanting to improve urban spaces and planning for working class people. So you've no longer got factories, you know, sitting cheek and jowl next to terraced housing. So you have this, you know, the rise of the planning system and the idea that we have separate spaces for work and for living, so that it's better for most people, and they're not living in polluted environments. One of the side effects of that kind of regulation, though, is that nobody thinks to say, okay, well, where's the space for caravans? Where's the space for people who don't want to live in a house? So although the planning system, when it was first constructed, wasn't done entirely deliberately to target gypsies and travellers' lifestyle, although what you get in the 1920s and the 1930s is a really strong push under sort of public health legislation to regulate all sorts of things, not just gypsies and travellers' lives, but also other people who are living in old showman's wagons, old railway carriages, in sort of plotland developments. So I think we can see some of, and I think we'll get onto it when we're talking in the questions and answers, some of the big problems that we start seeing by the end of the 20th century come around the regulation of space and how that in a very damaging way shapes the relationship between gypsies, travellers and the state. And I'm going to stop there because I've run on for ages. So Luke, do you want to come in and say some other things?
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, it's great to have some, like, a bit of backup firepower, to be honest with you. So, yeah, no, it's really good. So one thing I would say is that, like, I totally agree with basically everything Becky has said there. It's pretty much spot on. I mean, she has been doing this for 20 years, so that's probably what you'd expect. So, yeah, so you talk about when we first came here, like, people kind of forget, we come here and we're actually treated with kind of like welcoming, and like when we come to people's communities, a lot of us are still nomadic and things like that, but there's actually historical records of, like you say, us being invited to the courts of aristocrats and kings and queens and things like that, because we're new. And also a lot of us have very weird, well, it's not weird, it's kind of a different culture, so it brings in a different music, it brings in the fact like these people have different skills and things like that, so we are kind of welcomed. But what I'd say is, with any minority this could have happened, really, because an aspect of being a minority in a country is that often you're used as the pressure relief valve on society. When society's failing people, when society's failing to provide adequate living accommodation, adequate wages, when society's uprooted and in chaos, the easiest thing to do is blame minorities. And a minority that came here 500 years ago, before a lot of like mass migrations and things like that to this country, it becomes the easy way of doing things. It's just an easy scapegoat, basically. And you get this with a lot of, like, even in pandemics, historically pandemics, they would go, oh yeah, gypsy kind of plague spreaders and stuff like that, and they would go on down that route of things. But even though actually that comes about from some really strange things with culture and not living next to animals, while we're not really, and culture around cleanliness and things, is that we're actually really germophobic. Even today, we're really paranoid about viruses, germs and things. So weirdly, it's kind of like when people will go about a mosque or something, and they'll complain about people completely socially distanced, wearing masks and everything, but because they're a minority, it's an easy target, as this pressure relief valve on society, because the powerful can't go, actually it's us that are ruining things. They have to scapegoat. If not, the whole charade can't keep going. People will ask for more, right? So it comes about with things like the Egyptians Act of 1530. They start punishing us, and a bit like what Priti Patel's trying to do even today, is that they seize assets. They go, oh, all of these assets must be robbed, even though these people come and they're skilled metal workers historically, horse dealers, horse trainers, and metal workers. They would go, think about it, if you don't have, like, you could send away your watch or whatever, or get your horse shoed just anywhere. Like, what if you live in the middle of the countryside? These people would come and they'd set up camp, and they would do all your fixing your metal stuff and doing all sorts of services like that. Now, the Egyptians Act of 1530, like I say, it goes to seizure of assets. They try and forcibly integrate us. They take our kids away from us. But this is carried on the whole time. Even when we get into modern times, the state still takes our kids away at an unusually high rate. And there's studies on social workers and things like that. Even showing them where we live is more likely to make them think that they're more likely to take away our kids without even meeting families. I mean, there's some awful statistics out there and studies that have been done on that. In places like Romania, we're forced into slavery, and that slavery only finishes around between 1860 to 1875. So that slavery is relatively recent in history. A lot of us get sent to the colonies, so places like Spain and Portugal. They send us to places like Brazil. Brazil to this day has like millions of gypsies that live there, and they still keep their language and their culture going. So that's interesting. North America. We also have, like, the selling of public lands. I was saying about, we'd go around the UK doing all these services for people. We'd provide, be merchants, all this sort of stuff. The selling of public land. So we actually used to have places, the land used to be a lot freer than it was today, and you get Enclosures Act and things like that, where it basically removes public land and sells it to what's left of public land. They basically sell it to more aristocrats, and they just hoard land and things. But we used to have stopping places. So there's some really, Gypsy Hill in London, there are places where that gypsies have always stayed. Even when they moved around, there's places where we always used to stop. Those places have been turned into housing. They've been turned into, industrial spaces, things like that. So that's one of the issues. So when people are going, oh, unauthorized encampments is an issue, but we've always had this issue. It's just getting worse because all that land's being sold off or privatized or whatever. So historically, there are issues there, but also in the modern day. So I'll probably leave it at there, but I think you should definitely look at the Egyptians Act of 1530, I think it is, and look at the way they treat us. And they say, oh, interesting to Labour people actually is that when feudalism starts to become capitalism, well, we're really some of the biggest threats to that order, because we don't want to stay tied to the land. We don't want to work the land on behalf of aristocrats. That's just not our culture, and that's how we become a big threat. And our differences kind of bring us out in the open really, and punish us. So yeah, we are kind of the first bastion against this forced order that's become. Anyway, I'll let us move on to the next question.
Oh, I do think, picking up on that point, sorry, this isn't a question. I do think that in general, British Gypsy culture is not naturally Labour. It's this, and I think we'll probably move on to talk about it, that the problem I think that Labour has in terms of trying to build solidarity, which Labour does have a recent tradition of trying to support people from minority groups, but that's not a very long tradition. And I think actually with Gypsies and Travellers, with their history of not being unionised, of being small scale entrepreneurs and wanting to be left alone, very often the thing is just give us a place to live, and that's all we need, and just leave us alone. That's not a natural target constituency for the Labour Party.
Yeah, so
that's something that maybe Labour needs to think about how it might engage. I think it's a very different kind of mindset than the traditional Labour mindset, certainly old Labour.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'll just add to that quickly before we move on to the next question. I totally agree with what's been said there. And also, when you get to a lot of Labour analysis where people start talking about classes and things like that, how do you deal with a community that feels like it's completely outside of the system of class? Now, they don't feel like they're even in the working class. They don't feel like they're in the upper class. They don't feel like they even live confined to that system. So trying to explain like class politics or something, like my family would just be like, what the hell are these people talking about? And it's not because they necessarily disagree with Labour values. It's not because they'd be like, oh yeah, it's just because we've lived outside that sort of system for so long that we haven't, like, a lot of us just have no concept of what that means. Secondly, when the state comes along, there's usually two things, right? It's usually they want to murder us, put us on lists, and abuse us. So it's like we're very skeptical of that as well. So there's a massive trust problem, and that's not just under Conservative governments, but that's also under Labour governments. We've been abused, right? So any sort of trust of authority, local councils, any sort of source of authority, we're naturally skeptical of. So that makes it harder for a Labour Party to come in on that note as well. And like Becky says, is that we've always had to survive off the basis of like being merchants or being entrepreneurs or whatever it is, setting up a business. At the end of the day, if nobody will employ you, even to this day, if nobody will employ you, how do you survive, right? The only way you can do it is carrying on the culture. You work for your family business and things like that. So that's just the way it works. But what I would say is, on that note, don't give up if you're a Labour person, because Labour shouldn't be against small businesses, right? We shouldn't be against small family run. We shouldn't be against cooperatives. We shouldn't be against all these things, right? These are great. These are great things in terms of if we're going to keep this society as it is. It's just sell it to them on the basis we're going to level the playing field. We think big, small business, family businesses, shouldn't be punished, where big corporate tax avoiding multinationals probably should be punished. That's an easy way to win that vote, right? But yeah, I'll leave it on that note. But Becky's completely right there. So thanks.
Thank you for that. I think it's from both of you really fascinating to hear about like how sort of the history of the abuse of like different sections of the Gypsy Traveller communities is kind of like created like an emotional ricochet, and how that's felt today. And so like certainly in relation to like having negative connotations to the idea of a big intrusive state. So leading on from that, I know Becky, you already touched on it a little bit, but Luke, it would be interesting to hear about to hear your thoughts on it. But have there ever been really a time when the UK government has sought to improve the standing of these communities? And maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
I mean, in my opinion, there's been some effort in some places. When Labour government came in, there has been some. There was some sort of acknowledgement of there is some issue here. There is an issue with, there's a lack of places to live. There is an issue with the fact that, we had investment in Gypsy and Traveller liaison officers in schools, for example. We had like lots of stuff done on education and improving educational attainment and stuff like that. But other than that, there's not really that much that has been done. I mean, when you look at Tony Blair, the record of Tony Blair's cabinet and things like that, like David Blunkett, when he comes on and goes, I wouldn't live in the same neighborhood as Gypsies or Roma and things like that. That's where we're looking at this kind of home office, like home secretary, heavy handed approach that still exists, right? There might be improvements in education, but there's still a big sort of this idea, tough on crime and things like that. And it's like, well, a lot of the time, although they go, we're tough on crime and we're tough on the causes of crime as well, a lot of the time, tough on the causes of crime hasn't been there, but tough on crime has been there, if that makes sense. So they kind of failed to deliver half of their promise there. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people wouldn't probably complain if they fulfilled that their side of the bargain on both of those things, right? Because crime comes about, crime in the justice system doesn't come about. There's not this thing where there's a correlation of, crime and the British state with just Gypsies and Travellers or anything like that. It's all minorities in this country that suffer more from poverty than the average population. All of those people are going to suffer from higher incidences, in the justice system. The only thing that's related there, it's not a particular minority, it's just levels of poverty. That's the truth of it. And how well looked after a community is in society is directly proportional to how much crime there is. Now, there isn't some sort of, cultural thing where we're all like, oh yeah, let's go do crimes or whatever. That's not what happens. It's just not true fundamentally. And whilst we might be higher represented in the justice system than ordinary population, there's hundreds of thousands of us. If we were all involved in this, some sort of weird, ploy that politicians say we're up to, and we're all kind of dodgy or whatever, we would be far more represented than we actually are. And if anything, statistics say we're actually over-policed. If we were to do something wrong, we're actually more likely to be caught than the ordinary population. If we were to do something out of line, because we're over-policed, we're just more likely to get caught. As soon as something goes missing, what do people do? They go, oh yeah, it must be the Gypsy site down the road, even if they've got no evidence. So that's the truth behind it, really. So yeah, like I said, the British state hasn't really done anything. To be honest, they've made things worse. They've sold off, they've privatized public sites. So residential sites where people would live the whole year round, a lot of them have been privatized. There's been no sort of effort by the British state to say, let's do transit sites. If it's not just a fact that we lack residential sites, it's a fact that we lack transit sites, and nobody's ever engaged with that. They never engaged with the fact that, what if these people still want to be nomadic? What do we do then? Do we forcibly assimilate them? That's really the route that the British state's always gone down. Now, there has been interesting developments in places like Leeds where, for decades, I think it's quite a long time they've been doing it, but negotiated stopping. So the council go, oh, we've got this bit of public land, how long are you here for? We'll provide you with toilets, we'll provide you with access to rubbish disposal. How long are you going to stay for? And then negotiate on that, and it's a two-way compromise. But that's a lot better than going to the justice system and going or the civil courts and going, these people are just trespassing and things like that. It's better to say, well, there is clearly a need for these people to live. Let's pass sites, let's build more sites. So yeah, the British state hasn't really engaged. There's some good stuff in Scotland and Wales, but as a whole, it really, things are getting worse again, to be honest with you. So yeah, that's my view on it.
Becky, did you have anything else to add to that? I know you spoke about it previously a little bit, but
yeah, I mean, I think so. For me, I think again with my nerdy historian head on, rather surprisingly, before the Second World War, the Home Office actually was the main body that stopped anti-Gypsy Traveller legislation being passed. Because what happened is lots of local councils wanted to pass bylaws specifically against gypsies. And the Home Office said, no, you can't do that. We are the British state. We don't target particular minorities, and everyone is equal before the law. And so they stopped bits of legislation going through. So what you have, a very strong tradition in the UK, and obviously very different to what was happening in Germany at the time in the 1930s, is that you don't have any racially targeted legislation. What, on the other hand, the British state was very good at doing in the 20th century is regulating particular types of behaviour. So, for example, under the, so the provision of needing to have planning permission if you wanted to live on a piece of land for more than 28 days a year, obviously is going to disproportionately affect gypsies and travellers. Something like the 1959 Highways Act, which prohibits the lighting of a fire within 30 foot of a public highway. That's the kind of legislation that's not going to be used against some householder who's got a bonfire and their house is near the road, but is used to police gypsies and travellers who were mobile. So the British state has been very good at claiming impartiality, whilst actually being very good at targeting particular kinds of behaviour which have a disproportionate effect against gypsies and travellers. Whether, you can argue that's intended or unintended, there's arguments both ways in the archives. In terms of sort of positive impact, in fact, the two bits of legislation that spring to mind are, you'll all be excited to know, two pieces that are passed by Labour governments: the 1968 Caravan Sites Act and the 2004 Housing Act. And so the 1968 Act required local authorities to provide caravan pitches for gypsies and travellers living in or resorting to their area. So both people who were local to a district and people who were travelling through. But I think the thing that's really important to understand about that is that wasn't because they were nice about gypsies. Although, this is the reforming Labour government of, the abortion bill, the homosexual, the decriminalisation of homosexuality, and, so. But in fact, what it was trying to do there was not to say we want to give gypsies and travellers a space to live in our modern world. It was seen as being a step to assimilation. So it's like, okay, they can be in sites, and then from there they will learn how to be settled, and then they can move into a council house. The reason why the Gypsy Council, and there were gypsies and travellers who were also lobbying for this legislation, is because gypsies and travellers saw it as being, in an increasingly regulated world, the only way that they could carry on some semblance of a nomadic life within modern society. So there's kind of reasons why it passed, and it wasn't necessarily done for the best of intentions by the Labour government, but nevertheless it did have some of the effects that the Gypsy Council were hoping for. The point that Luke makes about the transit sites, I think, is really important, because what that was, to me, what that demonstrates is exactly this point, that local authorities felt that they, if they provided a site, it was going to be for their local gypsies and not as a way of getting them to settle down, not so that they could facilitate transit. Because you don't want that, because that's people just carrying on being nomadic, and we can't have that. Is essentially how it's seen. Obviously, the 1994 Criminal Justice Act, passed by the major government, removed that requirement, and that had massive retrogressive impact, because what it basically said is that we need to treat gypsies and travellers like the mainstream population, and they can just apply for planning permission like everybody else. They shouldn't have any special pleading. Though, of course, when you know that something like 97% of Gypsy Traveller planning applications get turned down, obviously it's a complete fallacy to believe that they can be provided through the planning system in the same way that works for everyone else, because of the endemic nature of racism against them. So that brings us then back to the 2004 Housing Act, where the new Labour government in fact sort of reinstated this duty of local authorities to provide culturally appropriate accommodation for gypsies and travellers, and that could either be housing or it could be sites once again. So that's where we start seeing the local accommodation needs assessments that was such a big thing in the 2000s. So, you know, planning and space and who's got a right to be where has been really central to gypsies and travellers' lives over the past 50 years. And that has largely been, I think, a retrogressive story, and one, if you people remember, say like the Big Dale Farm evictions back in 2011, and you know there's numerous cases like that on a much smaller scale going on across the UK all of the time, of people who've bought a private piece of land, they've sought retrospective planning permission and it's persistently failed, but they haven't got anywhere else to go, so they're not only are they evicted from the land, but they then also have to pay the costs of their eviction and they're rendered homeless. At the same time, as sort of, I think Luke was pointing out, what we see from the 70s is the rise of education being used not as a tool for assimilation, which is what it had been done up to that point, but as a way for accepting that gypsies and travellers have a right to be educated in a way that's appropriate for them. So we see the rise of the traveller education services, which we can tie to the, you know, if we want to sort of think back to the municipal multiculturalism of the 1980s, you know, the work of the GLC and the Inner Labour, the Inner London Education Authority, and people starting to go, no, the education system needs to be fit for purpose for everybody, no matter their ethnic background. So in that sense, we can see the coming together of sort of a bigger rise of, you know, multiculturalism and race relations politics, which does positively affect gypsies and travellers, but after the cuts, you know, after 2008, we've seen the absolute decimation of those traveller education services.
Yeah, I would just say, like, you know, I think back to this idea of kind of education, right, as like a forced assimilation and things like that, right, is that one of the key topics that I always bring up to people is this idea of like apprenticeships that's being pushed really hard to young people right now. Well, what I would say is that we've been doing apprenticeships for 100 years. We've been doing apprenticeships where we'd go work for a family business, we'd learn the family trade and things like that. But that wasn't acceptable. And it still isn't acceptable in a lot of cases, where they'd go and, you know, work for a plumbing business or, you know, work, you know, doing highways and stuff at 15 or 16 or whatever like that. But now we're actually pushing people to go to college and learn how to be a bricklayer and do college courses at 15 and 16. But because it's not Gypsies and Travellers doing it, it's okay. And this is one of the things, is that different rules get applied to us across the board than they get applied to ordinary people. One of the things I would say about transit sites, for example, is that you have that you can do a caravan club on a piece of land for like 28 days, and that's absolutely fine. But then when Gypsies and Travellers do it, it's not okay. It's completely illegal. The people, you know, you're doing dodgy things. You can't do it. You get planning complaints, things like that. When we come back to the planning system, we get people like Eric Pickles. So it's not just enough for Gypsies and Travellers to submit planning applications and then get rejected on massive scales because of racism. When we do get them, we get people appeal and say, we don't want gypsies in our neighbourhood, which is NIMBYism. Just even in the best case scenario, when you get Labour councillors or, you know, Labour people going, oh, we understand that they need a place to live, but just not on my doorstep or anywhere near me. So that's one of the problems that we get. The other problem is that, you know, why don't they just submit planning applications like everybody else? Well, like Becky's already talked about, you know, massive systemic racism in the planning system. And when you get to a point where the Home Secretary, not the Home Secretary, I think he was the Secretary for Communities and Local Government, I think Eric Pickles at the time, he was personally rejecting council planning applications from Gypsies and Travellers, personally doing so, overriding local councils, and he was in the High Court and actually got found, I think it was found guilty, he actually got found guilty of discrimination and things like that. So it's so, the deck of cards is so stacked against us, it's just ridiculous. And then we get this other issue. It's like people go, well, unauthorized encampments, we have all these problems with unauthorized encampments. You know, why can't they apply for planning permission and live on those things? So we've already talked about systemic problems in the planning system. So they'll form an unauthorized encampment. You go to the unauthorized encampment, there's rubbish places, because councils and local authorities will refuse to provide them with bins and refuse to do anything for them, because basically the local population will come along and go, well, they don't pay council tax. And then you go, okay, well, if they don't pay council tax, provide more camps where they would pay council tax, and then they would pay for those services. And then they go, but we don't want them in our area. So it's a chicken and an egg situation. And then they go, well, why don't you provide transit sites and then get rid of their rubbish and things like that, where they'd contribute to ground rent or things like that, where that would contribute to taking away rubbish and stuff like that. Well, no, because they don't pay council tax. And then it goes back in the cyclical argument. And it's like, these people have no power to change anything. 85% of us live in houses, by the way, and half the time you wouldn't even know that we're there. So these 15% of these cases, it's like there's a chicken and egg situation. And basically one side doesn't have any power. So it's just putting the blame onto a community that has no sort of agency to change things. It's just exploited, like we're talking about historically, as this pressure relief valve. When society's collapsing, wages are stagnant, people are getting more aggressive and more irritated and agitated. It's just easy to go, well, unauthorized, they're not following the law and I'm following the law and things like this. And it's just putting all this blame onto these people that don't have this power to change it. But the planning system's always kind of been stacked. And these new changes of criminalisation of trespass, it's just a continuation, really, in my view, of these historical trends, basically. And like I say, when people go, criminality and things like that, and they'll talk about things like unauthorised encampment, it's like, well, no, that's not a criminal. It's not a criminal offence at the moment. It's a civil offence. It's like they will make laws to criminalise us. It's like, and that's what historically what's happened, right? We've been criminalised by law. So yeah, anyway, that I'll leave it on that note so we can move on to the next questions, but it's quite interesting, really.
Thank you for that. I think it's really interesting number one, to hear about sort of the decoupling of ideas around sort of the intention behind legislation and its actual effects. And I think it's also really important for us to, often be more critical of past Labour governments, like specifically, the often lauded sort of 45 Attlee government. I think it's really refreshing to hear some of those more nuanced takes, particularly focusing on how a lot of their legislation, a lot of things they introduced affected minorities. So moving on sort of to the present day, what structural barriers do Gypsy Travellers currently face in this brilliant pandemic COVID world that we live in? So Luke, do you want to start this, and then Becky?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things I would say in this kind of pandemic world that we live in, one of the biggest things that we face is the fact that a lot of these people have nowhere to live. A lot of us are self-employed. So all my family have always been self-employed since the beginning of time. Nobody's ever had a job working for anybody else apart from me. So I'm the difference there. So when there's no help for like self-employed people and things like that, that really affects our community badly, like terribly. Secondly, the whole social system and things like that, it just doesn't work for us at all. It's like the whole education system also doesn't work. Everything's just made a lot worse. Really, during this pandemic, we had people that were, nomadic and still going, still in transit, basically, and they had nowhere to go. And they were still being evicted during a pandemic. Well, what's the worst thing you can have in a pandemic? Well, the worst thing in a pandemic you can have is a mobile community going from place to place because they have nowhere to go. So that's one of the worst things they've been affected. Now, some people have tried to seek shelter and housing, and landlords have said, frankly, we don't want you here. We don't want to let to you even at these historic highs of rent. Some people have just offered to pay in advance their rent, and landlords have still not taken it. So that's massive racism. And recently, you know, on the page, we've been talking to estate agents who have been openly racist on social media. So think about that. Like, you can't even get shelter in a pandemic. Like, that's insane. You know, there's a massive barriers to jobs in terms of like getting employed. So I've written a few articles, right? And I've been to a graduate job. So we're not even talking building sites. We're not talking that. For a graduate job, I've had people look at my article and go, are you a P word or a K word? Because they've seen my article on Google. Now, my accents have changed and things like that since I've been in education and things like that. Those things have changed for me. But when they know that I'm from that community, I will get asked these ridiculous questions, which are like racist. I should have taken them to court, but because we've been brought up with that, we've been taught that it's normal, we just accept it and move on. Well, I don't want to accept that anymore. It's not good enough. So there's some of the barriers we face. Then when I talk about, you know, these, so let's say we go to a, you know, we come to the age of 18. We've been bullied in schools our whole lives. People have been calling us, you know, abusive language. They've been saying we're criminal. When our friends have found out that we're from the communities that we're from, or their parents have found out, more importantly, they've gone, well, you know, my parents said you can't be around us anymore because you're from this community. You get stuff like that. So that's like quite traumatic for children to go into. They've built these bonds with people and they've just thrown them away, you know, out of whim just because of where you're born. It goes through schools. The teachers will basically take part in some of this racism. The school system is more likely to expel us, to suspend us. You know, not give us the, you know, the special educational needs some of us have, you know, like tests for ADHD, tests for dyslexia. They'll just go, oh, well, they're just stupid, and just give up on us. Or they go, oh, their sister went through this school, they didn't do any good, so we'll just throw them in the academic bin or whatever. So we experience that. Then let's say they want to become a bricklayer, they'll go and become a bricklayer, right? So they'll go to a building site, can I have a job? No, sorry, we don't employ your kind here. We don't employ, and that legitimately happens all the time. Okay, so they'll go work for themselves. They'll knock on a door and trying to get work or whatever. People are, sorry, we don't employ your kind here. Okay, great. So I'm left in this position again. And then after a week worth of being completely demoralized, after an education system that's completely demoralized, after, you know, the planning system that's left us completely demoralized, and a lot of us have been left homeless and things like that, we'll then go to the pub like everybody else does, or we'll go to the cinema, or we'll go to restaurants. We'll be turned away from cinemas, restaurants, and pubs. We don't serve your kind here. So one of the things I would say is that there's this idea of a social contract. Like, people like Labour Party go, you know, oh, we'll give you this opportunity to be housed, to be fed well, to, you know, to make, you know, a decent wage or whatever it is. And in return, you follow the rules that society sets. And there's kind of a social contract bond there. Well, we've never had that social contract because the state has never fulfilled their side of the bargain. But what they're saying is, you fulfill your side of the bargain, and then we'll fulfill your side of the bargain. Well, many of us do fulfill our side of the bargain. You know, we're still not left in that much of a better situation, really. But that's what I'm saying. It's literally demoralizing from cradle to grave. We're demoralized. We feel like society doesn't care about us. We feel like, you know, councils are out to get us. The state is out to get us even. And a lot of the times we're right. like convincing our community to take up vaccines, for example, like, that's a big deal in our community because we just don't trust the state, because every time the states come knocking, they're up to something most of the time. So you just got to really break down these trust barriers, and it's going to take, unfortunately, yes, it's a negotiation from one side and the other, and we have to kind of meet in the middle and compromise, but these people exist, right? This is why I give these talks and stuff. There are people that are, you know, trying to make things better, but society doesn't fulfill its side of the bargain. So that's what I'd say. And it's like, if you're an 18-year-old and you go to the pub after a week's, you know, knocking on doors or whatever, and people are saying this to you, you'd feel completely hopeless. You'd feel like, you know, this society is basically out to get us. So that's what I'd say the barriers are, is big. There's a big barrier of trust. There's a big barrier of, you know, healthcare. So people, you know, without a permanent address trying to get to a GP surgery, that's really difficult. People need to claim universal credit, really difficult. Setting up businesses, really difficult. All these things are just made, the barrier for entry for all of these things is just made like really, really hard. Yeah, I mean, and also these outcomes don't improve when we're in housing either. That's the weirdest thing. It's like, people are like, oh, if you assimilate, you'll be okay. Well, you know, 85% of us have moved to housing, and you know, we have been integrated, as they say, but we still experience all these bad health outcomes, all these bad education outcomes, and things like this. So it's just a lie peddled by the state, because they don't want to fulfill their obligations. And if anything, we actually get less spending, you know, per head of the population, if anything, than ordinary people. So it just doesn't make sense to me. So yeah, well, I'll finish on that note.
Yeah, just to come in, just to sort of summarize, I think if you're thinking, I mean, you want to know about what the structural things are, because if as a Labour Party you want to change things, you need to know where are the points to intervene. The planning system, the most unpopular, the most difficult, but the one that would make the most impact. Being able, I think, both the travel education services and the health services, which were directed at Gypsy traveller populations and have been hit so badly by cuts, by austerity, the same as everybody else, have made a really big difference. They make a really big difference to people's lives when they do exist, and they help build the trust and build those connections. There has been work actually within UEA. Hazel Marsh in Dev, who is from a Gypsy Romany background, has done some work with the local outreach teams to try and bring Gypsies and Travellers to UEA to raise both the aspirations of Gypsies and Travellers to move into the education system, so they're not seen as being just cast on the scrap heap, but also I think to reduce the prejudice of academics too, because I think one of the things that we collectively need to do as majority society here is to own that racism, which, you know, so many people, I think, haven't had direct contact with Gypsies and Travellers in their life. Where do they get their opinions from? It's going to be from the media in most cases. 95% of that media is negative. And in fact, you know, having done, I mean, I've given talks, for example, at, you know, the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies research seminar in Sussex. I do my History of Gypsies and Travellers talk that is a bit of a standard thing. And then first question is from the managing editor of the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. And she basically goes, well, that's fine, but what about, I'm sorry, Luke, the pikeys living at the bottom of my road, who are making a mess and causing problems? I don't mind the real gypsies, but it's these other ones that I've got a problem about. And so it's actually one of those things that, you know, I mean, people talk about whether you call it Romanophobia or anti-traveller and anti-Gypsy racism, they say that it's the last acceptable form of racism. And in fact, I don't think that's true, because as we've seen, there are still so many acceptable forms of racism, but it's nevertheless the case that people who normally know enough to not perform their racism in public still don't know enough to not perform their racism in public when it's to do with Gypsies and Travellers. So I think it's kind of one of those things that we have a personal responsibility for calling out and taking action, whether that's in face-to-face interactions, in conversations with people when we're talking about these things, whether it's on social media, to actively intervene and say, no, we stand alongside people. Because, as you know, as Luke is saying, I mean, I was involved in a piece of research that was done by the University of Sheffield back in the early 2000s, which was the first sort of systematic study looking at Gypsies and Travellers' health in relation to other populations. And as Luke has said, you know, on every single measure, Gypsy and Traveller health is much, much worse than even the most other deprived groups across the UK. And, you know, when you have women who, you know, you sit there in their trailer and then they tell you stories of being evicted as they're giving birth, of their children dying because they can't get any treatment at the local GP surgery or A&E, and people are turned away, and ambulances won't go onto a Gypsy Traveller site because they haven't got police protection. And then you see how, for people, you know, from before someone is born from a Gypsy and Traveller community, they're taught that their life is worth less than that of the rest of us. And that, you know, it's, you know, it's marked in people's bodies. I found it really hard to find Gypsy Traveller interviewees over the age of 60, because actually their life expectancy is so much less than it is for the wider population. That's how much the prejudice and, you know, the everyday experiences of marginalisation mark every single Gypsy Traveller body in this country. And so, you know, thinking about access to services and targeted services is absolutely central to shifting the narrative and settled society taking on some of the responsibility for changing this dynamic. Because as Luke says, the power here isn't with the Gypsy Traveller population, it's with us.
I think it's interesting, right? It's not just about finding interviewees and stuff like that over the age of 60. It's hard to find people that have claimed a pension. Yeah, it's honestly hard to find people that have even claimed a pension. Like, that is how difficult it is. And it's not just health outcomes that we live 12 years on average shorter lives. Our education outcomes are the worst in the country, and people will stand up and go, oh yeah, white working class lads are left behind. Like, that might be true, some of them, but they've rolled our statistics in and they've not even bothered to aggregate them. It's not racism because white kids, and all this like nonsense. And it's like, well, actually, you're missing the point that you haven't even disaggregated that group, and there's huge amounts of racism actually when you do that. Social work, our kids getting taken away, that's happened. Midwives, like, these people, I always say to people, and like, I'll finish on this because I'm sure there's questions that people want to ask, but when people talk about racist, we all have this idea of what a racist looks like in our head. But racist to us are judges, social workers, counsellors, nurses, doctors, like people that should know better, civil society, people that society's built upon, civil servants, right? Like, that's what we're looking at. We're not looking at, these dodgy far right groups. We're looking at people, people that everyone respects. Like midwives go, a Gypsy and Travellers going to give birth, and the midwives are like, oh yeah, well, I'm surprised that you have teeth. Like, what? That's madness. Like, some of the stuff that we hear and experience is just ridiculous. The levels of just vitriol as well. And it's just like, it's just incredible, to be honest. Anyway, we'll move on to questions or whatever you want from us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know we've covered quite a lot of terrain quite quickly, and I am just conscious of time. So has anybody got any questions they want to ask? If so, feel free, just unmute yourself and go for it. Or if you don't want to ask vocally, then feel free to also just write it in the chat and I can read it out for you if that's easier.
I've got one, if you can hear me.
Yeah, you're good.
I just wanted to thank the speakers for how composed they were in outlining the struggles of gypsies. I'm reminded of the words of somebody more famous than me, that we should tremble with indignation at the injustice that goes on to our fellow human beings. I'm also mindful of the fact that anti-discrimination talk in this country at all levels is largely all talk and no content, and I won't go further than that, but I think you know to whom I refer. I wanted to ask you directly, both to Becky and Luke, given the fact that gypsy culture is so widely appropriated in film and also TV drama, you've seen obviously Snatch and Peaky Blinders, what efforts have been made by the gypsy community to take a larger media profile on those issues? And also, somebody, I think Tony Booth, was it, mentioned the fact that, I think very helpfully mentioned the fact that he was looking to involve you with the Jewish anti-discrimination work. What steps have been taken to link your struggles with the Jewish community? Because if there's any historical recollection still left in this country, I think most people know that the Jews and the Gypsies were persecuted by the Nazis. And on days like Holocaust Memorial Day, anybody with a memory of more than 5 seconds should be involved in proselytizing and also propagandizing, if that's the right word, for a recollection of that struggle and the fact that it still continues today, the amount of discrimination that goes on against Jewish and Gypsy communities. So have you thought further about linking your struggles with their struggles, because they are the same struggles? I mean, most of the things you said, even though I'm appalled to hear them, are things that Jewish people would identify with, certainly black people would identify with. Have you thought further about working more with them, and also putting greater pressure on a Labour leadership that seems to talk the talk about discrimination, but, well, to put it politely, doesn't necessarily walk the walk?
Do you want to go first, Becky? Or?
Yeah, I think I can probably speak more to your things about people who've tried to counteract what we see in the widespread media. So there's organisations, so not just like so Traveller Times, for example, who I've put a link to earlier with that. The infographic video, they do quite a lot of both cultural work but also lobbying work and policy work to try and both act as a legitimate voice for British gypsies and travellers, but also to try and campaign to offer different perspectives. Also organisations like Traveller Movement, for example, I was involved with them a few years ago when they put in some complaints about My Fat Gypsy Wedding, for example, and the representation of traveller communities in other popular television programs. So there is that kind of work that's going on. And similarly, if you let's click on that link on the the heritage page of Traveller Times, you've got people like Damien Labar, who's quite a high profile British Romany journalist and writer who writes some fantastic creative pieces trying to express what it means to be a gypsy in British society. And Traveller Movement too are similarly trying to promote cultural sides of things as well, because I think in the same way that when people think about gypsies and travellers and crime, they never think of them as victims, but they think of them always as perpetrators. When it comes to thinking about gypsy traveller culture, we're very happy to impose these exoticised and romanticised or criminalised images of what gypsies and travellers are like, but we're not so interested. Yes, Jake Bowers as well, as a Romany journalist, also does some excellent work. So actually taking the time to find out about those cultural voices and those other ways of being and seeing and doing. So part of the research project that I'll be doing over the next couple of years, when we're going to be collecting oral histories with gypsies and travellers, partly around crime, but also because they're oral histories, it's about trying to get the full story and how people's experiences of crime as both victims and offenders fits into this bigger picture that Luke and I have been talking about of marginalisation and vilification. And then Damien Labar, in fact, was going to be doing some cultural, and some creative outputs based on those oral histories that we're going to try and get out there to try and have a different way of gypsies and travellers being represented in public spaces around these kind of debates. So I think as much as possible is about amplifying the voices that already exist, and then where you see that there are campaigns against Channel 4 because of their odious television programme last year on gypsy traveller crime, back in April. Luke, you probably remember it with horror. So where people are actively fighting against these things, to stand alongside. And these days on social media, it's not so difficult to do those things and to follow those links and make sure that you're seen as an active ally and not just an empty mouthpiece. But Luke, you've probably got much more to say on that than me.
Yeah, we're misrepresented, to be honest with you, but it's not just history. Like, that history is translated into media. Like, how many people when they're growing up watch things like The Hunchback of Notre Dame and things like that, right? They're massively racialized and demonizing and things like that, like from Disney to Peaky Blinders to look at the end of the day, it's all the way down Snatch, like all these things. But when it comes to actually telling, people that have done good stuff who are gypsies and travellers, right? Even if they come out and say, I am a gypsy and traveller, and literally just, publicise it for the world. If it wasn't for Tyson Fury putting it all over his boxer shorts, right, you could definitely think, right, that they would pretend that he was from somewhere else. Like, that's the way it is. Anyone who does anything marginally impressive is erased. It's only people that, the only news that makes it to the news on our community is bad news, because it's the only news that sells. Nobody wants to see us succeed. That's the truth of it. There's plenty of, you know, books that have been said to be made into films that have never happened because people are racist. There's plenty of Marvel characters, for example, who are meant to be from our communities, you know, that are completely erased. That side of the story is completely erased when it turns into like films and stuff like that. So like the Marvel universe is a good example. When there's a good or interesting story to be told, nobody wants to listen. And it's the same way. It's a bit like the Holocaust, right? The Holocaust is a terrible, you know, a horrible event that we should remember for hundreds of years, right? But when you ask people about, you know, how many you know, Gypsies and Roma were killed in the Holocaust, nobody wants to talk about it. You know, when you do polling on people and say, oh, how many Gypsy Travellers were killed in the Holocaust or whatever, but barely anybody even remembers that fact. And, you know, secondly, modern states, like we often think about like modern, you know, Western liberal democracies or whatever as these like, you know, beacons for the world. You know, Germany basically turn around and say, oh yeah, they might have been killed, but it wasn't because they were gypsies, it's because they were criminals. Like, okay, big erasure going on there. So that's one of the reasons why things like Holocaust, you know, memorial isn't remembered properly, in my opinion. And go back to, you know, intercommunity solidarity. The only reason I'm here talking to you today, and the reason why I even do these talks in the first place, because I was encouraged from people from the Jewish community, from the Black community, things like that. It's the only reason I'm here, is because, you know, we have those people that want to help and know how it feels, right? So I was encouraged by a lot of Jewish people and stuff to do this, and regardless of it, even when our politics don't even align, like people like the Board of Deputies, now they could be better, they could definitely be better. People like the Jewish Labour movement, and but even others, even more, you know, more left-wing Jewish groups as well. All of these communities, it doesn't matter what our policy difference is, politics different, they'll support what I'm doing, or what we're trying to do is educate people, and that's why we're here. So that intercommunity stuff is happening. In terms of the Labour leadership, well, you know what, I've been in this party for a long time, for, you know, half a decade, right? And honestly, I think it's an absolute disgrace, to be honest with you. The fact that we've got this thing in the Home Office coming out about the criminalisation of trespass, and, you know, they haven't even got the courage to tell us what their position is. So, you know, frankly, it is performative. And when you talk about the pandemic and vulnerable kids struggling, well, who do they think those vulnerable kids are struggling? Well, loads of us are actually struggling, but apparently, you know, we don't matter that much to be told. What, you know, what do they think these people on, what do they think about these kids on transit sites? Well, not transit, unauthorized encampments. What do you think is happening to them over this pandemic? What do you think is going to happen to them when the criminalisation of trespass comes out? Now, we do have some allies in the Labour Party, so, you know, we have a few MPs, and from all parts of the party, by the way, we have people like Kate Greed to people like Zara Sultana. We have that mixture there, but it's not enough. And too often, you know, people going, I'm not looking forward to these debates, put it that way. And I fully expect there to be Labour politicians standing up saying problematic stuff. And the leadership should really come out and say what's what. They have our details. They have my details. You know, a Baroness has my personal email and things like that, right? Feel free to get in touch with me. I wrote a letter to the leader of the opposition. We wrote a joint letter from our personal email addresses, by the way, with our names and things. You know, if they want to get in touch with us and tell us their position, even in private, if they even have the courage to do that, then fair enough. But we think it's you know, a disgrace, frankly. So yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm, you know, I'm no longer really involved in active frontline politics, but I'll make it my business, I assure you, to champion your cause. And I want to thank my good comrade Kate, for putting this on, because we need these kind of talks so that people are aware of this kind of discrimination. And the little I can do, I'll do. And I hope everyone else who's listening to this talk does, because this shames decent human society, and we should all be indignant about it. So thanks very much to both of you.
But I think just before we move on to the next question, I know there may well be other people who want to ask things and can just unmute themselves, and I know there's also a couple in the chat. But I think there's also like often a tendency to assume that like there is like an innate sort of leaning towards solidarity between different minority groups, whereas, you know, obviously I can't speak from like experience in and represent sort of all minorities, but certainly within kind of LGBT and a lot of Jewish circles, I know that there's, you know, very deeply ingrained kind of anti-Gypsy traveller sentiment. So I think we're definitely not immune to bigotry, and I think, you know, as much as we need sort of education or re-education as much as anybody else does. So I saw Bert Bremner pop something in the chat, but I can't see where it's gone now.
And Tony Booth has his hand up, I've noticed quite a lot.
Oh, okay. Tony, do you want to go first while I'm finding this?
You're on mute.
Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yep. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm in Jewish Voice for Labour. I also a long-standing educationalist and happen to be working on a project trying to do something about reducing discrimination against Roma in some countries in Eastern Europe, which is, you know, it's an almost impossible task, but people have to keep trying, otherwise it removes hope. But I think that the issue that I wanted to mention now is that being in Jewish Voice for Labour, where myself and others were very against any idea that people should see a hierarchy of racism. And I think this comes back to what Luke was saying about memories of the Holocaust. And it wasn't just Gypsy, Roma, it wasn't just Jews, it was Poles, it was Slavs, it was communists, it was disabled people. And, you know, we mustn't shorten the narrative or abbreviate the narrative. And I think the worst side of it, in a way, at the moment, and particularly is I think what you were talking about, this erasure, this silencing and I think you were referring to, is it Kate? You were referring to this sense of, you know, minorities do trumpet their own oppression, and this in a way can silence the oppression of others. So I just wanted to say that we're particularly concerned to avoid giving any impression that there should be a hierarchy of racism or a hierarchy of anti-racist action. And that, as Kwaku was saying, I mean, the oppression of anybody shames all of us. So I'm for creating an alliance, and if I'm in a group called in an anti-racism alliance working group, we're trying to work with others on this basis of equality of action and equality of oppression, and delighted to talk with others.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there seems to be a hierarchy of racism for sure, and I mean, I don't know where it's come from. I mean, the way I see it is that, you know, my struggle is the same struggle, you know, what Jewish people face, what Black people face. To me, you know, it even comes down to the point, right? There's not a single group out there that, you know, I think's worth less or valued less or anything like that. Like, you know, for example, in the Labour Party, for example, transphobia seems to be okay. Like, that seems to be fundamentally fine. You know, anti-Gypsy racism seems to be fine. A lot of stuff is just, I just find it appalling, to be honest with you. And like, it's great that you've recognised this issue. Do you know what? Right, though, I am very kind of skeptical at where we go from here. I think, you know, the bar is really set at the ground floor, you know, at ground level about where this is going and how much is being done. Because personally, I just think, you know, if electoral politics comes into it, well, you know, we're the most hated group in the country, so we're the easiest to throw under the bus. And if anything, you'll probably get more votes by throwing us under the bus. So if that's where our party's concern is, then I just don't see things getting better for people like me at all.
They're going to get better.
Yeah, I really do hope so, but it does feel like oftentimes, it feels like you're paddling a canoe against a tsunami, and I always say that in the talks, because it just seems like this criminalisation of trespass, the fact that we've not heard anything, like Labour is obviously a million times better than the Tories. So let's get that straight for a start, right? Million times better on this than the Tories. So we'll start off there. But
from a very low bar.
Yes, a very low bar, extremely low. Like we're almost in the negative, right? But it's just the fact that I just see this change coming, the criminalisation of trespass. I don't even think Labour councils have realised how bad this is going to be. Like how many kids are going to be potentially using social services, or forcibly using social services, let's say, people going into the justice system, people having their assets seized. So there's something worse than, our form of homelessness, and that's, actual homelessness, where not only do they not even have a trailer to live in now, they literally are rough sleeping with their children. Like where do they go after that? Like, so yeah, and the charities that we have that are looking out for us, they're not going to be anywhere near be able to handle the capacity that we're looking at. We're talking about thousands of families are going to be uprooted and basically destroyed by this. And I don't think Labour has actually considered what the score is. And I beg anyone that thinks, I'm a doomsayer or whatever, or anybody working for a council, Labour or Tory or whatever, I beg you go speak to these charities, because they'll tell you exactly what I'm telling you. This is like doomsday. Like this is bad now.
I think Luke's absolutely right. If you're sort of looking for an immediate place to start, the proposals to criminalise, trespass with the intention of settling is absolutely, not only will it be absolutely catastrophic for Gypsy and Travellers, but also for anyone who's got any interest in longer histories of protest, from Greenham Common to the anti-roads movements in the 90s to the HS2 things, those kind of the little gaps that were left in British law that allows some leeway over active, sustained and effective protest, as well as Gypsies and Travellers' lives, will be completely it will just be ripped away overnight. And it's a massive point of concern, I think. And perhaps if people are feeling fired up and actually interested in intervening, then this is perhaps one of the immediate places to start. I kind of wanted to pick up on what Luke was saying, and also the question in the chat from Dylan about the blind spot in terms of prejudice against the Gypsy Traveller community, and maybe also to offer a small point of hope. So I've been this is something that I think about quite a lot, because as well as doing research on Gypsies and Travellers, I've also look at minority groups more generally. I've just been doing a big project on refugees in Britain in the 20th century. And I've been thinking a lot about kind of, race and the rise of anti-racism, as well as racism within British society. And what I've got to thinking is, if we think about, the active challenges to racism in British society from the 60s was led a lot by people of colour, by, Black and Asian first and second generation activists who went, this isn't good enough, we are fighting back. And of course, at the same time, the 60s is a time we can think of as being, quotes, the Gypsy Power movement, as well as the Black Power movement. This is when we see the establishment of the Gypsy Council, and activists fighting and actively trying to stop forcible evictions. I think the big difference from that point onwards is that Gypsies and Travellers have been massively hampered by a lack of literacy and a middle class that actually the Black and Asian populations, they may have been much more recently arrived in the UK, but already had a middle class. They already had levels of education, so that people, yes, they faced racism, but within a generation, by the 80s, you see, large numbers of Black and Asian people starting to move into local government, into education, into the health service, and in a way that Gypsies and Travellers, are still struggling. And I think, I think and so, you know, the fact that, you know, the way that Luke is talking about how education is making differences within Gypsy Traveller communities, and actually that's something that we need to start seeing through, because, you know, I think the fight for the voice of Gypsies and Travellers has to be led by Gypsies and Travellers with allies. And the more people who have the time, and because education isn't just about making people articulate, it's about giving people the time and the space to think. And to be able to say, oh yes, I can see the connections between what's happening with me and what's happening with you guys over there. Whereas if you're only ever fighting from hand to mouth, moving from one pitch to the next, and being, you know, chucked into prison, or, you know, your families are disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system, it's a really hard position to fight back. And actually, I think the rise of the internet and social media has made it much, much easier for Gypsies and Travellers to organise and stay connected, because back in the 70s and the 80s, if you're perpetually being moved on and you haven't got mobile phones, and and you're, you know, you're not dealing with large levels of literacy, how do you actually stay in touch with people? How do you communicate? How do you use the basic tools to fight back? And I think Gypsies and Travellers now are much better positioned than they were to be able to do that. But it is a fight that they've been fighting with probably both arms tied behind their backs. Does that sound fair, Luke?
I mean, it sounds reasonably fair, yeah. And I think, but I think, you know, there are people that have climbed up. There are people that have, there are people that, you know, have become middle class or whatever, or got middle class jobs or whatever it is, and
but have often hid their identity.
So that's the thing. So, like, believe it or not, we have doctors, we have lawyers, and, you know, we have nurses, midwives, and everything else, right? Nobody wants to report on that. But until we come out and go, you know what, actually, you know, I do this for a living, and, you know, I'm a Gypsy and Traveller, and, you know, even if you work for your own, the thing is, what I'd say is that education doesn't have to be that we force our kids to university and all this talk about, exactly, you know, higher. It could be like, you know, it comes from both sides, right? It comes through a, you know, compromise, negotiation, things like that. If you go to Gypsy and Traveller families, not I want to force your kid and, you know, forcibly assimilate them and make them into some, you know, some educated normal person or whatever. You just say, look, it's good for your business, it's good for your family that your kids can read and write. It's good for the fact that, you know, when they're 16, they won't be, you know, absolutely, you know, beside themselves, the fact that they can't do a tax return or something like that, or even when they want to do planning applications and things like that. I found that my education, it's not even related to that. I did engineering, for God's sake. Like, it's not even related to a lot of this stuff, but I found it has helped me when it goes to me standing up in the High Court and saying, oh, you're doing a High Court injunction against persons unknown. I don't have a law degree. I was interested in it, but I don't have a law degree. But yeah, I can stand up in the High Court and say that, you know, these laws are affecting us in this way. What you're doing is, you know, against human rights. Councils aren't providing us somewhere to live. Things like that. I can make those arguments. Not as good as a barrister, but, you know, if we can't afford barristers, what else are we going to do? So yeah, I would say education is truly. It is it does free us in some way, even if you don't want a job, even if you want to work for yourself. I do think that a good level of education is important. But I think the way the state goes about it, and the way schools go about it, and teachers go about it in a patronizing way and things, it massively backfires. My sisters left school early, you know, but I didn't. It only took one teacher to get me excited. So it only takes one teacher to make all that difference, right? So yeah, that's what I would say. But you are 100% right. If your main concern is survival, you're not thinking about tomorrow. You're not thinking about the next day. You're thinking about, you know, right now, 5 minutes time. Am I going to be arrested? Are my assets going to be seized? Are my kids going to be taken off of me? Am I going to, you know, it comes to this point where some really sickening things happen in this country, like you'll have race and equality law and things like that, and then a pub will reject you on the basis of your identity, but then ring the police to enforce that racism. Instead of the police coming along and going, actually, you know what, you're actually breaking the law here by being racist, they go, actually, no, it's within their rights to withdraw you service for any reason. That's actually not even legally true. Like withdrawing service on the basis of someone's race and protected characteristics, that's highly illegal. So that's the sort of stuff we're talking about. But obviously, if you're educated and you know the law inside out, well, they can't do that. You'd sit there and go, well, actually, that's illegal. What are you doing? I'm not moving. Serve me. I'm not moving. Take me to prison, whatever, because you should know your rights. And that's the thing. We don't know our rights, unfortunately, and we need to. So education can be a big help in that respect.
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry to interject, but I'm just mindful that we've got a lot of time and that we've got quite a few other people who have questions. So, Susanna Lord, you've had your hand up for a while. Do you want to jump in?
Okay. Yeah, I'm just sort of going to ask a couple of questions about the main sort of, I don't know, culture clashes, problems between the GRT community and the non-GRT. I'm really apologise if anything I say is offensive. I am aware that even in a sort of fairly liberal middle class family, there was a lot of prejudice about travellers, gypsies, during my childhood. I think it really is the last acceptable racism. Okay, so I wanted to ask, are these issues largely true, exaggerated a lot, or completely false and sort of made up for various reasons, and in your analysis? So the first one is crime. As we know, I mean, you know, there's always crime stories, and there's loads of stories about sort of sophisticated criminals, gangs who burgle sort of big houses and huge rings of people, and that tend to be linked to the traveller community. Is that generally true, or is that again an exaggeration, or an unfair highlighting of a very small minority of people within that group? The other one is begging. That's like, this is the Roma thing. People say, you know, that they see Roma beggars around various usually tourist sites in major cities, and there's all these rumors about begging rings and then going off to taking people off to the cash point and maiming their children, and all these rather wild stories out there, but they are fairly prevalent. And the other thing is, the problem with the left is this sort of intersectionality, in that if you are against oppression, as you say, you should be against all forms like transphobia, like anti-Jewish racism and all that kind of thing. But there is a slight issue. I've seen clashes where people feel there's a slight clash, again, probably from misrepresentation from these programs like Gypsy Wedding and Gypsy Fighting and all this kind of thing, where people feel that I don't know if it's the culture is somewhat misogynistic, where girls are getting married very young. Apparently, we're told there's a lot of domestic violence. It's hard to get domestic violence help, and even some testimony from some traveller women that there's higher rates of domestic violence. I don't know if that's true. And also,
not to interject, not to interject too much, but what I would say is that you've given quite a lot there for us to tackle. So what I'd say is that, like, I could tackle the things that you've said. If there's anything you want to quickly add, I'm just saying I don't want to take over everything. That's all.
The only other one was the intersectionality, the worry about violence, blah blah blah, and the bare knuckle fighting, and the fact that Tyson Fury comes from that background. He's done a lot to raise the profile, but the fact that he's a boxer perhaps isn't quite helping that kind of stereotype. I don't know. And again, that's the last one.
Okay, I'll go about answering these pretty quickly, to be honest. Yeah. So let's do it. Okay, so let's start on crime. Okay, so crime basically is not a problem with our community as such. It's not a cultural thing. What I'd say is, where there's instances of poverty and deprivation, crime is more prevalent. In minorities are over policed, so crimes are more likely to get caught out. That's another thing. There's like 300,000 of us roughly, so if we were all criminals, we'd be like, you would know about it. So that's one thing. There are criminals in our community. There's criminals in every community. Thirdly, when it comes to organized gang crime and things like that, if you look at the actual prevalence of gypsies and travellers, well, it probably might be noticeably prevalent, but so are white people, like so are white people from Essex or whatever. Do you know what I mean? crime comes from the fact that the only relation that you can make between an ethnicity and crime is poverty and deprivation, like I say. Begging, so lots of begging happens around tourist sites around Europe. That's for good reason, actually, and the reason for that is because of forced settlement, the fact that many of these communities are forced to live in slums, so places like Czechia, now I think it's called, like Czech Republic, used to be Czech Republic, places like Slovakia, places like Romania. Well, a lot of these things are actually enforced by poverty. The fact that these people actually cannot get a proper job because they're discriminated against. It's the same, same with our community. If our kids wanted to get a job in society, I'm lucky I've managed to do that. But that's come from 20 years of forcibly code switching constantly. I've had to change my accent. I've had to change everything about myself. That basically I've been forcibly assimilated. Essentially, I came back from university. My family barely even recognized who I was. That's the truth of it, right? So that's what we're looking at. And when I've written articles and I go to interviews and they go, "Are you a P word or a K word?" That's how prevalent this sort of racism is in civil society. That's for a graduate job, by the way. So talking about the left intersectionality, so on a lot of issues we're quite far behind the curve because we're left behind essentially. So on a lot of things like LGBT rights, we're quite behind, but things are getting better. So for example, recently there was a person on Drag Race who was a Romani, right? Things like that are getting more prevalent. There's going to be more representation, but things are going to get more accepting. And it's not to say we don't have problems as a community, because a lot of the time people are quite socially conservative, and that's just because our culture revolves around families and all this stuff. Something Keir Starmer should be really on board with, if anything, right? He should be answering those questions. So intersectionality, back to that, misogyny and anti-women stuff. One thing I would say about anti-women stuff is actually that in this white paradigm and in this capitalist paradigm that we've got today, misogyny that's kind of manifested itself in society, people take that cookie cutter approach and apply it to our community. They're not taking into account the fact that our community has been different from day one. The role of women in our community and the levels of respect that women are given and things like that has been different from day one. So this idea that people like Jess Phillips can come along and talk about the women in our community, and I mean, they could talk about it better than I can, because they've experienced it, right? I'm just saying, because I'm the only speaker here who's not a woman, I'll say this, right? Getting married young as a woman is not necessarily a bad thing if that's what that woman wants to do, right? It should be all about choice, right? Feminism should all be about choice. And if they're forced to do that, then that becomes a problem. But I think a lot of people in ordinary society mix up the fact what our culture's like and what women want to do with what they think women should do. And it's a bit like these feminists that will come along and talk about like, the veil, or they'll talk about headscarves and things like that. And they're talking about oppression and things like that. But have they actually asked those women whether that's what they want to do? Is it about giving these women choice, or them having the choice, or is it about enforcing what you think is? I'm not talking to you personally, by the way, sorry about that, but I'm talking about, is it what you think women should look like in your society, right? Like I say, we've been a different society from day one, so you cannot compare what happened to women during suffragettes and things like that to what's happened in our community. It's a completely different
I'm just saying,
like domestic violence,
probably the way they portray it, actually.
For sure. No, for sure. I'm not saying you are saying that. I'm just saying, for sure, it's the way they portray it and things like that, because people, it is genuinely the way it's portrayed. And like I say, people use this cookie cutter approach to go, oh, women in our community were abused like this, therefore they're abused like this in that community. We have our problems with domestic violence and things like that. But like I say, all communities genuinely have those problems. It's just that when there's a negative thing and you've got our community alongside it, it's much more highlighted in the media and things like that. But like I say, there's a lot of work to be done on these issues of intersectionality. Like, I'm not saying the work's done. It's getting better, I think, personally, but there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of things, like my cousin wrote a book called Gypsy Boy and things like that. And that highlights some of the struggles that LGBT gypsies and travellers go through, and there's a lot of things like that. There's a lot of stories out there. So I'd like to think that it's getting better. One thing about like Tyson Fury, this idea that bare knuckle fighting and boxing, I just find that kind of, it's not saying like you're saying this. I'm just saying I find that quite like patronizing. I find it in a way like looking down on someone else's culture. It's like you wouldn't come along and go, oh yeah, you know, violence, and then like a different community that, for example, goes to their temple and has swords and things like that. You wouldn't look at it in the same way, right? It genuinely comes through this idea. Not all, you know, boxing isn't just about violence. And I feel like that's a big reduction to think, oh, it's about, like, for example, in this country, youth boxing clubs and amateur boxing clubs have probably done more for our community than any level of social work. And I'm happy to say that with my chest, genuinely. It has saved kids from some of the worst outcomes. It saved kids from prisons and all sorts. It teaches kids discipline. In fact, actually, when you look at like correlations between like knife crime and boxing and martial arts and things like that actually are inversely related, if anything. So things like boxing, I'm proud of that in our community. I think we've done some amazing things. I think, you know, Tyson Fury, for example, I think, has he always been perfect? No, of course not. He said some bad things about LGBT people. He said some awful things along the way, but is he getting better is what you've got to ask yourself. You know, are people being educated in our community by his education? You know, people by his role model, the fact that he boxes, he trains hard, he does all these things. You know, is that something to be ashamed of? I don't think so. I think boxing is one of the most kind of colourful and vibrant things about our community, actually. And I think things are better settled in a controlled setting than they are settled, you know, out in the zoo, out in the wild kind of thing. So yeah, I think that's a bit of a kind of middle class look on, you know, looking down upon boxing, but they'll go out and do a boxing fox hunt. Do you know what I mean? Like, we'll get these people and be like, but half the time these middle class people are paying to see professional boxing fights, and you're just kind of sitting there like, what the hell?
I'm just saying that it's often like it's a sort of mutual incomprehension between sort of liberal, middle class, less leaning people, sure, and a community that they really have, I mean, I certainly don't have absolutely no experience or knowledge of.
But at the end of the day, this is why I do these talks, right? It's not because you're asking these big, horrible questions or anything like that. It genuinely isn't. I don't take people like you in bad faith at all. It genuinely is. This is why I do these talks. For people like you, this is why I do this. Genuinely, because you can ask anything and I will happily answer it. I have no judgment of you whatsoever. And genuinely, this is such a better dynamic. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, the more you meet people like me, you wouldn't think, if you saw me in the street or you saw me in a job and we worked in the same workplace, you wouldn't think, oh, he's a gypsy. But that's half the problem. The fact that you think like that, oh, that person can't be, that person is, or like that. Yeah. That's half the issue, right? The fact that middle class people go, I go to people at university, right? Middle class people. I go, I've got a degree in chemical engineering. They go, nah, you can't be a gypsy. It's a lie. It can't be true. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, how do you win with that? Like, so that's all I would say. Is like,
because I think, Luke, that's exactly right. Because I think when you're confronted with these racist stereotypes, that actually all you're asking is to be granted the same humanity and complexity that, you know, everyone else grant, you know, that we as the majority of society grant each other. And, you know, we don't have to, you know, I don't expect as a, you know, white middle class female academic to have to stand for all white middle class women every time I speak. You know, people accept that there's a whole different range of being and doing, but if you're a gypsy traveller or if you're from another migrant background, you're seen to represent everybody. So if you're a criminal, then obviously all gypsies are criminals. If you're a boxer, obviously all gypsies are boxers. We wouldn't expect, you know, I wouldn't expect to be judged as a British person by how people behave in Ibiza on holiday. You know, that's not my culture. That's not how I am. But, you know, there are some people who live in Ibiza who would probably rightly, you know, want to have particular stereotypes about, you know, British people because of how they experience things. But actually, they only stand for themselves. They don't stand for all of us, and neither should any single gypsy or traveller or any other person of, you know, colour or, you know, Jewish person. We should all stand for ourselves in that sense, and we're not representing anyone other than ourselves. And to be forced into that position is something that racists do. And I think to push back against that and say, no, I am myself, and I'm a complex person. You're a complex person.
Look, one thing I'd say is that, like, I I wouldn't go to someone and be like, oh well, you're a normal person, do you know Ricky Hatton? Like, oh yeah, do you do the same things as Ricky Hatton? Do you know what I mean? Like, but I think this goes deeper, right? If Labour wants it, like, people come to me and go, oh yeah, Labour must win the next election and all this stuff, right? Genuinely, the level of ignorance I find in the Labour Party, right? They're never winning election among working class people. If they come here, I'm not saying you did this. I'm just saying, if they go, oh, you're working class community, I hate boxing because I'm a middle class liberal, whatever. Do you think they're going to win those red wall seats? Do you think they're going to win people that rely on amateur boxing clubs, things like that? Like, this is what I've been saying. It's not about, people go, oh yeah, I've got to be right wing in Labour to win the electoral vote. I've got to court Tory votes or whatever. That might be fine. That might be fine, right? But if those same people are doing that and going, I think boxing's really bad because this, and they're looking down on those people, patronizing those people's culture, right? They're never winning. They're never winning those people's votes, not in a million years, the longest day I live. So that's the thing. It's not just about racism here. I'm genuinely giving the Labour Party, I'm calling them out and saying, look, we'll have this discussion about us first, and then we'll talk about how you misrepresent working class people, you misrepresent the culture. And that's not to say every working class people likes boxing. I'm just saying a lot of people do. But the way we talk about it, a lot of people in the Labour Party as middle class people, they go, oh, those working class people, and they just like put them in a complete other box. And they're just sitting there like, are we like zoo animals or something? Or are we actually people you want to win vote? You know what I mean? So I think that's a deeper issue. But I like the way I like the way you've answered that, Becky. But yeah, we shouldn't have to answer for the crimes of others. It's like somebody came on a stream, right? And I'm sorry to go on. I know you're worried about time, right? But sorry to go on. Somebody asked me about a police officer being murdered in Reading, and they asked for my comment on the fact that a police officer's been murdered. If people are asking me, like, I'm not ashamed of the fact that this has happened by any human, by the way. And people are asking me that with a serious face. And I turn around and say, and this sounds really horrible and it sounds really like critical. But in order to make a lot of people understand, I have to put it in these words. And I hate doing it. I don't go to somebody from the Northeast and talk about a guy that went and murdered a police officer and then ask for their opinion on it or ask them to apologize on it. And I would never do that. But that's the level of kind of ignorance people have towards us, right? They will genuinely, legitimately ask, what's my opinion? As if my life's not going to be affected. The only people that are more affected than Gypsies and Travellers on the killing of that police officer is actually his family. It's his family, and then all of the rest of us are second in line. The fact that we have to experience all the racism and hatred and vitriol that comes back to our community on the basis of that. When we see that in the news, we shudder. Our spine is chilling. The fact that we're going to have to go back and face our work colleagues, or we'll face our customers, and they're going to ask us about it. Like, genuinely, that's the way it is, and honestly, it feels horrendous. But yeah, and this level of like criminality, people talk about criminality. Genuinely, when you go to people's houses as a kid and their parents follow you around the house like you're going to steal something, like that genuinely happens to us. It's traumatic. It's psychologically traumatic. And then you wonder why we end up in the justice system. It's because that's all you people expect from us. And I'm not talking about you personally. Sorry, it's passionate like stuff. But that's what I'm saying. You expect us to end up anywhere else when you make our self-esteem that low and you treat us that badly and you talk about us in the newspapers like we're vermin, like we're a parasite problem. Like, I don't understand where else you want us to go with that sort of thing. That's all we've ever aspired to, because that's all you've ever told us is okay. Like, that's all you've ever told us that we're capable of, right? And we're not. We're capable of far more. So far more. And whether that comes to Tyson Fury boxing, or whether that comes to Gypsy and Traveller barristers hitting up the courts, or whatever it is that we're going to do, nurses, doctors, everybody. And you don't have to be that. You could run your own small business. But middle class people seem to think like this idea of being self-employed, oh, isn't it shameful or whatever? I respect those people. I think it takes an incredible amount of courage to get up in the day and go, I'm going to run my own business. Do you know what? I don't want somebody to give me a job. I'm going to make my own job because that's all we've ever known, because nobody would ever give us a chance. And that's the truth of it. So, yeah, sorry if that went on a bit long, but
yeah. Thanks.
Not at all. I think I'm just conscious that we're nearly hitting the 2-hour mark, and people no doubt have families to go back to, and a gin and tonic waiting for them or something. But I think that's a really, really astute point to end on. So thank you so much to both of our amazing guests for coming, and also for everyone else who's come. That has been one of our biggest events for a good while now. So it's great to see so many people turn out. But yeah, so we're going to end it now. I'm sure if people do have any other specific questions they want to ask, are they okay to contact you both?
I put my email in the chat, and if
okay, cracking.
I made a couple of very useful connections, and thank you for having me. It's been really interesting, and it's been lovely to meet you, Luke.
Right, no problem. Right, see you. Bye.
Thanks for having me. Also, Becky, get in touch anytime. Anybody else wants to get in touch with me, Labour GRT Twitter page, send me a message, whatever.
It's a very good Twitter page, it's got to be said.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you. All right, thank
you. You'll be appearing on like that new Lefties Hotties page, just Labour GRT, alongside like Zara Sultana and Grace Blakely.
Look, it wouldn't be the first time I appeared alongside at a talk with Zara Sultana, and do you know what? It'd be my pleasure, because honestly, I can't even tell you how much respect I have, and Nadia Whittam, and even Kate Green. But I mean, she's kind of silenced a bit by being in the cabinet and things like that. But you know, it's not about a politics left or right. Generally, there are people on all sides of this thinking this is shameful and we need to do something about it. So yeah. Anyway, have a good evening, everybody. See you later. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Bye.